Oh, thank you all for coming. My name is Rich Pankos. I'm the director of the Cabot Institute. I'd like to welcome all of you to the University of Bristol and our third Coleridge lecture, which is a production of the Festival of Ideas alongside the Cabot Institute and also Bristol 2015. And of course, also welcome to George for coming here and speaking. Actually, I wanted to say welcome back. We have a little bit of a longer history. 10 years ago or so was a visiting academic in the School of Philosophy, and we're very excited about renewing that relationship. From a bit of a personal perspective, one other funder for these events has been the European Council, and that's been via a grant to myself and collaborators in the climate change community. So I'm just going to take my Cabot director hat off for a moment and speak for a moment as a climate scientist and as a biogeochemist. And really, what this grant has funded is our exploration of this uncertain world in which we live in. We know that carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing. The world will warm, the oceans will become more acidic, storms will become more intense. We know that. But also their entire world is incredibly complex. And there's a lot of things that we don't know how they're going to operate on a much warmer planet with higher CO2. And the goal of this project is simply to look deep into the past and learn a little bit about what can happen in the future. Now, I can give you lots of examples of that complexity, and we have these little cards where we prompt all of you to talk about your uncertainty about the future. But I'm going to use an example that George wrote about last autumn. And where's the, I want to make sure I get the title right, because it's very important. It's like, Why Whale Poo Matters. Now, if you Google Monbiot and whale poo, you'll find the article and you'll find the YouTube clip as well around it and such. And basically, it's just an example of how complex and wonderful and beautiful our world is because of these linked biological and chemical and geological processes. I'm not going to explain it to you, but it's something that we study now. But basically, the upshot is we don't know the consequences of all of our actions, and that should cause us to be very, very cautious in our future. So that's the first reason I'm very proud to have George Monbiot here, is that as a climate scientist, George, you did your degree in zoology, and a lot of your work really is deeply embedded in the natural world around us and a respect for how we collaborate and partner and work with that natural world. And that's something that is, I think, of profound interest to all of us. If I slip in my director of Cabot hat back on, the obvious other connection is the fact that because of how we're impacting the world, there are political consequences. This is going to be a big thing we talk about in the Green Capital. We are going to talk about what should we do? What actions do we take? What actions do we take as individuals? What actions do we expect our city council to take? George Ferguson to take? Our national government to take? How does that influence how we make our decision on the 8th of May? And that comes to one of the main reasons we're very proud to have George here. Not only because you're going to speak to what a green government could do, but because so much of your writing has been so powerful about the obligations of leaders and what governments could do if they really, really tried. And I'm very excited to hear your most recent thoughts on that. And you've been writing about that for a long time. George asked me, don't talk a lot about me. All of you all know the many achievements, right? 250,000 visits to the blog, fantastic articles in The Guardian, numerous books, most recent of which, I have lots of props for this intro here. Feral, which has the brilliant subtitle, Rewilding the Land, Sea, and Human Life. And this is a really, really beautiful book, and it's just the latest of many and such. The third reason, personal reason, I gave you my scientist reason, I gave you my Cabot reason, now I'm giving you my personal reason, is that actually, quite often, I read the things you write, and it gets me angry. Not because you point out things I should be angry about, but because you're saying things that are inconvenient, challenging, things that disrupt the political narrative that I want to believe in, and we need that so much, more now than ever before. And it's not just because you challenge, but it's from a very robust intellectual framework, well-informed, well-referenced, evidence-based, and we need people who speak challenging thoughts, are not upset, do not worry about upsetting people, but do so from a very profound intellectual and evidence-based framework so that at the end of the day, when I'm upset, I can't dismiss it because it's robust and strong and compelling. And that is why I think all of us are really excited to hear George Monbiot tonight. And I'd like you all to join me in welcoming him. Thanks very much.
2 weeks ago, the Infrastructure Act 2015 achieved royal assent. It's a huge and rambling act which makes a mockery of democracy because there are so many issues in there which are unrelated, which are controversial, that you cannot say yes or no to it while making a meaningful decision. If an MP had voted yes, did that mean that she accepted everything that was in that bill? It's impossible. If she voted no, does that mean that she rejected everything in that bill? Also impossible. These huge omnibus bills destroy any sort of meaningful representative political process. But that's not the only thing that was profoundly wrong with it. Before talking about what it contains, let me take you back to the 2008 Climate Change Act and remind you of how it came about. There was a massive campaign over the course of many years involving a lot of environment groups and individual campaigners, primarily led by Friends of the Earth. It was brave, it was bold, it required buckets of energy and commitment and creativity. It involved hundreds of thousands of people. First of all, to get the government to adopt the bill, then to get the political parties to support it, the individual MPs to support it. A massive, humongous effort was made, which was, I believe, democracy at its best, involving people right across the country. It could not have happened without us. It was a bill which came up from the grassroots and eventually found its place in Parliament, and it introduced something which seemed beforehand to be impossible, a political consensus around the aim of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 and committing all governments between then and 2050 to that aim. An astonishing, remarkable achievement. What a fantastic thing to happen. But in the Infrastructure Act 2015, there is a section which is the Climate Change Act's evil twin. Because what it does, it uses exactly the same instruments that were pioneered by the Climate Change Act, the long-term commitment on secretaries of state with reporting intervals and all the rest of it, to, I quote, create a legal obligation on successive governments to maximize the economic recovery of UK petroleum. In other words, while the Climate Change Act 2008 obliges governments to minimize the consumption of fossil fuel, the Infrastructure Act 2015 obliges governments to maximize the production of fossil fuel. Even government ministers might be able to detect a contradiction there. And in fact, the contradiction is heightened by the fact that it is the same Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, who's responsible for both policies. So evidently this unfortunate person will be minimizing greenhouse gas emissions by day, then after a stiff dose of potion will go out at night to maximize them, because they will have legal obligations to do both things. But what makes this really extraordinary is the way in which this came about. Because it was introduced without any debate, without any public process, without any public engagement at all, while the bill was already going through Parliament. In fact, there were large chunks of the infrastructure bill which were not presented to Parliament when it was first submitted for debate. And the minister responsible, Susan Kramer, Baroness Kramer, said at the beginning, well, look, there's a whole lot of stuff which I'll be sticking in later, but don't you worry too much about that. It's an extraordinary trampling of democracy in itself. And this particular section came about because the government commissioned a man called Sir Ian Wood to write a review of what the future of the UK's petroleum industry should be. Sir Ian Wood is a billionaire who inherited his company, the Wood Group, which supplies services to, what was it? Oh, the UK petroleum industry. And astonishingly, he concluded that it should be helped by every possible means to maximize the economic recovery of the UK's petroleum. This is how these reviews work. You appoint the former head of the National Farmers Union to look into what the future of farming policy should be. And wow, that's amazing. I never would have guessed he would have come up with a bonfire of regulations as his proposal. You appoint Count Dracula to advise the government on the privatization of the UK blood bank, and, well, you get the picture. And then the government can say, well, look, you know, what we did, we commissioned an expert review by these august and dispassionate personages. I mean, you know, Count Dracula has a long-standing involvement and an interest in this question as one of the major customers, and his commitment to the future of the industry is evident. And then you can stand back and say, well, all we're doing is implementing their recommendations. You appoint the people who are going to give you the answers that you want. So on the back of the Wood Review, Baroness Kramer says, well, oh yes, by the way, as this is going along, let's just put this thing in from the Wood Review, these recommendations, we'll just turn them into legal language and plonk, drop them straight in onto the back of a legislative juggernaut which is already halfway along a 6-lane motorway. So in other words, while the Climate Change Act required this vast public mobilization and public engagement, its undoing within the Infrastructure Act required absolutely nothing. It required complete political silence, which is what we've got. It was virtually unopposed in Parliament. Labour just seemed to miss it altogether. Just wasn't there at all. There wasn't engagement with it. It was completely unknown to the public. Hardly surprising. Most MPs missed it, because it was just slipped in, smuggled in surreptitiously halfway through the process. And what you saw in operation there was, well, you can no longer call them lobbyists because they are in the engine room of government. The only people consulted were the petroleum industry, and they were consulted by someone who provides services to the petroleum industry. And there he was, implanted into government to implement what that industry wanted without any reference to the public at all. How many people in this room believe that that's the way democracy should work? Thank you. And this illustrates, too, the extreme danger that the ways in which democracy is bypassed poses to the commonweal, the commonwealth, whether it's the environmental commonwealth of the natural world, which we all depend on, or it's other forms of social assets, which we also depend on, and how easily that can be subverted and captured. And to stick to this theme for a moment, the British government has gone out on a limb by making this a legal obligation to maximize the production of this fossil fuel, petroleum, oil. It's possibly the only government in the world which has done this so far. But in terms of general policy, all governments with fossil fuel reserves, with the arguable exception of Saudi Arabia, have exactly the same commitment to maximize the economic recovery of oil, gas, and coal. And yet, almost all governments at the same time have this commitment to minimize the consumption of fossil fuels in order to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, in order to prevent climate breakdown. It's not that there's ever any attempt to resolve these issues. Well, they resolve themselves, don't they? You've got these feeble, pathetic measures which have to be applied to 7 billion people. If there's to be any chance of limiting our consumption, they don't stand a chance against the continued production of fossil fuels whose only purpose is to be burnt. If it comes out of the ground, it will be burnt. And collectively, this makes climate breakdown inevitable. And the amazing, astonishing thing, which George Marshall found while researching his excellent book, I think the most interesting book on climate change published in the past few years, Don't Even Think About It, He discovered that throughout the entire period of 23 years of international climate change negotiations, there hasn't been a single position paper, a single statement, a single debating point put forward at an international climate change meeting about leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Almost uniquely, every other international issue of this nature, if you're trying to deal with, for instance, the depletion of fish, sure, they do it very badly, but you don't just say to people, will you please eat less fish? You set quotas. You say, the too many cod are being caught, so let's catch less cod. If you are trying to limit the trade in endangered species, you don't just say to people, please consume less rhino horn and elephant tusks. Hopefully, you're going to be trying to stop people to do that as well. You also try to limit poaching. Drugs, whatever you look at. People, when governments try to deal with something, when they want to deal with something, they're going to operate probably primarily at the production end and only secondarily at the consumption end. But in this case, uniquely, the production end is completely ignored. And they know that that means that nothing is really going to happen, that things are not going to change unless we are leaving fossil fuels, the great majority of our fossil fuel reserves, in the ground. And George Marshall describes this as a socially constructed silence. We don't talk about it. We talk about changing our light bulbs and driving a more efficient car or getting on your bicycle or whatever it requires, but you actually don't talk about the one thing which will actually really change things, which is leaving fossil fuels in the ground. You don't talk about that end of it at all. What that allows you to do is to ignore the role of the fossil fuel companies, to ignore what they're up to. It allows you to give yourself an impossible task of regulating the activities of 7 billion people rather than a few thousand oil refineries, coal washeries, gas hubs, and the rest of it, which is so much easier to regulate, and it allows you not to confront that huge industry which probably provides your political funds and is extremely troublesome if it starts pushing against you. It can overseat governments and all the rest of it. So a socially constructed silence is not something that happens randomly or accidentally. It's something that happens to protect powerful interests from public scrutiny and political and democratic engagement. It's to protect powerful interests from democracy. And we are surrounded by socially constructed silences. My life's work involves trying to rudely interrupt socially constructed silences. Let me give you just a few examples. Benefits. No, not the benefits the poor receive. No silence about that, is there? Constant assaults upon the poor and who are characterized as shirkers and scroungers for receiving this pittance and put through so many hoops that some people are forced effectively to give up receiving any income whatsoever. And, well, a man not far from where I live died of starvation recently, having had his benefits cut off. The suicides, the despair, the depression, the massive health impacts this is having. I mean, this is a vast catalogue of horror being imposed upon the poorest people. No, what I'm talking about are the benefits the very rich receive. The richest of the rich, the landowners. The public money they receive for owning land. We call it farm subsidies, but you don't have to be a farmer to receive it. All you have to do is to keep your land in what is called agricultural condition. That doesn't mean you have to produce a ear of wheat or a leg of mutton in your whole life. You just have to mow your land every 5 years or so in order to ensure that there is no ineligible feature on it or unwanted vegetation. The rest of us call it wildlife habitat, but that's what the rules call it. Make sure there's none of that, and then you can claim your money. In medieval times, there was a tax called feudal aid. And this was a tax that the vassals had to pay their lord according to how much land the lord owned. Today, the basic payment scheme, which is the backbone of the Common Agricultural Policy, is simply a payment per hectare of land. The more land you own, the more money you're given by taxpayers. And so the very richest landowners, who are the very richest people of all, the 0.1% of the 1%, scoop up millions. Well, how is this possible? It must be that dastardly European Union at work. In July 2013, the British government implemented its £26,000 cap on the amount of benefits that a household can receive. July 2013. In the same month, it went to Brussels to lobby furiously against the €300,000 cap which the European Commission wanted to impose upon landowners receiving farm subsidies, landowning subsidies. At the time, €300,000 was exactly £260,000, 10 times the cap it had just imposed upon benefit seekers at the other end of society. It succeeded, with massive backing from the National Farmers Union and farmers' unions around Europe, it succeeded in ensuring there would be no mandatory cap. The cap would be voluntary. As a result, there are people in this country who literally are taking millions of pounds every year in taxpayers' money for them having the good grace to own huge chunks of the land upon which we stand, and for no other reason. Were the government to impose a £26,000 cap on the benefits the rich receive, we'd be saving at least £1 billion a year from that. But it's completely out of the question because it is not even a question. We do not discuss it. It doesn't feature as a political question. It doesn't come up in the political conversation because it is surrounded by a deliberate, socially constructed silence. These people are protected from democracy. That's how it works. And there are scores of such silences all around us. I could go on and on. Maybe in the questions we could dig out some more. But indulge me a little while I expand on this theme because it is amazing. Last year in April, the government followed this up under Owen Paterson by doubling the subsidy for grouse moors. We subsidise grouse moors in this country. We subsidise these places owned by the very richest people. There should be a provision, there is a provision under the law, the European Union cap laws, where you can declare land as not being actually agricultural land and it can be taken out of the agricultural envelope and declared unsuitable for the receipt of subsidies. But instead of doing this, our government doubled it. It doubled the subsidy for grouse moors in the age of austerity when essential public services are being cut. In the same week, David Cameron intervened to ensure that shotguns remain subsidised. It costs the police £196 to issue a shotgun licence. It costs you only £50 to buy a shotgun licence. We are subsidising shotguns to the tune of £17 million a year. Again, it does not feature in political debate. This goes on and on. There are hundreds of such instances. And you would have thought, you might have hoped, that an opposition worthy of the name would be unpeeling some of these socially constructed silences, informing us about some of the things that are kept from us, doing democracy a service by opening up questions which have been deliberately shielded from democracy, by exposing rich and powerful interests to the democracy from which they have been protected, starting to document the vast, crucial, enormous injustices that surround us, and to lay out a big vision for contesting that injustice and for putting things right. And if we ask ourselves why this coalition built on such shaky foundations, which seems on paper to be so politically weak, has been able to do things that even Mrs. Thatcher never dreamt of doing at the height of her power, well, half the answer lies with the fact that the opposition has been so sodding useless. Open goal after open goal completely ignored. Characterized by timidity, by terror, by a sense that we cannot possibly offend Middle England. Learning nothing from the example of Scotland. You know, look at this. You ask a big question. Now, whichever side of the question you fall on, it doesn't really matter. You ask a question big enough, engaging enough, visionary enough, and people will come out to vote in droves. People will queue until midnight, night after night, to register themselves to vote. You know, the government says, or rather the opposition says, because it's greatly in the favor of Labour that more people register to vote, because generally it's potential, I was going to say left-wing voters, that doesn't really make any sense for Labour, but it's people who are not to the extreme, to the right of Attila the Hun, who are more likely not to be on the electoral register. So the more you can get the vote out, the greater the progressive vote is likely to be. You know, and Labour frets and worries at this question of how we're going to increase the vote, how we're going to increase electoral registration. But the one thing which is required to do that, vision, isn't even on the cards. Labour, you know, has a whole series of defensible policies. It can defend them before a completely corrupt corporate media, and it can produce prices for them all. It can cost everything. But for us, who are looking for leadership, who are looking for a guiding light, who are looking for vision, well, it seems to us that they know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Perhaps the Greens have the opposite problem. But, I hope that can be amended between now and May. And it seems to me that we cannot have a revitalization of politics, politics as we understand it, parliamentary politics and the rest of it, without a massive grassroots movement which is going to start to put these issues on the agenda and break the social silences. And so I meant to be talking about what a green government could do if it really tried, but actually that comes second. It's what a green population can do if it really tried. It's what green citizens can do if we really try. And my sense is that there are two priorities which anyone who wants to see substantial radical change, and who could deny seeing where we are at the moment in this world of outrageous inequality, economic inequality, political inequality, environmental inequality. Who could deny the need for radical political, economic, and environmental change? If we want to see that happen, there are two priorities we have. We have to try to apply. The first is the breaking of social silences. To look for them, to seek these social silences out, to ask yourself, that issue's never in the papers, but that doesn't mean it's not an issue. Why is it not in the papers? Why are we not discussing this? And one of the reasons why I associate so little with journalists, there are quite a few of them actually, but is that it's not so much that if you talk to each other too much, you all end up having the same view on a particular issue. I mean, that is a danger as well. That's not the primary danger. The primary danger is you all end up having the same view of what an issue is, of what is a valid issue and what doesn't count for anything. The spotlight of the media is an extremely narrow one. The media, of course, is one chamber of the corrupt heart of Britain. And its narrow focus, again, is no accident. You know, if the spotlight falls on benefit claimants, that is no accident. These are the people we need to demonize. These are the people we need to characterize as sucking the lifeblood of the nation dry if we're going to push the whole polity even further to the right, if we're going to rip apart the social safety net, the social fabric of the nation, create a society which is entirely governed by the 1% without the need to effectively mediate with democracy, then we need to demonize these people. So that's where the spotlight falls. And so, you know, people On both the left and the right, they get into arguments, well, how many benefit claimants are benefit cheats? This is a big issue of our day, and the right says it's this many, and the left says it's this many, and, we really need to see, let's go and see, so do work with benefit claimants, see how many of them are taking the piss, and how many of them are really doing what they say, and the rest of it. And fine, yeah, we need to be contesting this stuff, but at the same time, there are these great looming dark areas on all sides of us where the light does not fall. And there's this constructed consensus. I mean, it's subliminal most of the time. You don't even know that you're engaging with it, but this constructed consensus among journalists as to what counts, what is worth writing about, what is worth talking about. And every time, every week when I write about something that no other journalist is writing about, I feel a cringe. I feel, oh, God, can I say this? Can I say this? They'll just mock me. They'll ignore me. I'm bound to get ignored. There's no pickup of this stuff. There's no echo chamber for these issues. But they'll just think I'm a complete wally for writing about this. I mean, why would you want to write about that? Fish? You're writing about fish again? Who would write about fish? Who in their right mind would write about fish? Well, maybe I'm not in my right mind, but I actually think that fish is very important. You look at what we're doing to the seas, it's outrageous, it's extraordinary. But, you write about fish and you hear the jackal laughter of your colleagues echoing down the corridors. So you have to resist very hard being disciplined by that consensus. So part of our role is to try to break that consensus, to break the social silences, to bring into view issues which are being deliberately hidden. But the second priority that I think we should apply if we're going to create the political movements out of which green governments grow is to frame all that within the context of hope. We are very good as members of environmental movements at pointing out what's wrong. Well, I'm one of the worst offenders. And we need to keep doing this. I'm not for a moment suggesting we should stop doing so. There's an awful lot wrong and there's an awful lot we should be pointing to. But at the same time, sometimes we lack the dynamic, inspiring, positive vision which actually encourages people to become involved. Because when your vision consists of follow us and we'll have a slightly less crap world than we would otherwise have, it's quite difficult to galvanize public enthusiasm. Whereas follow us and we can have a much better world than the one that we have today, well, then you can really begin to build a growing movement which doesn't burn out. Anyone who's been involved in campaigns for a long time will know that one of the greatest hazards of all is burnout. You can do it for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and then suddenly you're overwhelmed by despair and you can't take it any longer and you drop out and become an aromatherapist. That's the trajectory that I've seen 100 times. Of course, there are some radical aromatherapists. I can see myself getting pelted with lavender oil after this talk. And we have to keep people in the game. We have to keep ourselves in the game. We have to sustain our strength of purpose, our determination, our dynamism, which can get us through this incredibly difficult political world that we have to navigate, where we're up against it on all sides. We're up against the political machines, we're up against the media machine, we're up against the corporate machine. We're fighting on all sides, and to sustain ourselves through that, well, we need a lot of communality, we need a lot of mutual support where we protect and defend each other, and the building of political movements which are able to do that is a crucial part of it. But at the same time, we need these hopeful, positive visions which are going to continue to inspire us as well as drawing other people in. And it's not that these are lacking. It's not that they are not there. It's not that you have to invent them. You have to dig them out and emphasize them, which is something we often are not that good at doing. And I just want to suggest one or two. There are hundreds that we could point to. But one or two ideas which I think have got the potential to really galvanize people and around which political movements can start to be built around a positive environmentalism, which can then feed into the development one day of a genuinely green government. It won't happen on May the 8th, but May the 8th could be a beginning. I mean, what we're seeing now is this extraordinarily exciting period of political fragmentation. And blimey, do we need political fragmentation? For so many decades, we've seen this 2- or 3-party system, which is just a system of stagnation and stasis and exclusion of competing ideas and competing views. These great grinding Goliath parties which have this tremendous top-down control, allow very little in the way of diversity, very little in the way of the ferment of ideas, the flowering of ideas, which we need if we're going to get out of the mess that we're in, where you have a choice between the 2 main parties or 3 main parties of big business or bombing, and you can choose your variants according to your preferences, but not a choice of so many of the things that people are desperately crying out for. So I think this fragmentation is a tremendously exciting thing. And I love the fact that the 3 foremost radical parties in this country, radical or radical-ish, Plaid Cymru, the SNP, the Green Party, are all led by women who are inspiring, who are grounded, who can sometimes conduct interviews, who completely break the mold of what we expect politicians to be. And there's something very exciting in this. And I look to Scotland in particular, to the extraordinary ferment which is taking place there, regardless of the outcome of the vote. It didn't matter. It turns out it didn't matter. Things are just as exciting now as they would have been if it had gone yes, because people got engaged. People started joining up to political parties in vast numbers. People started to see that actually it is worth being involved in politics. That the sort of anti-politics promoted by UKIP, this demagogic anti-politics, is dead in Scotland. There's none of that in Scotland because people see there's something worth aiming for here. There are visions big enough, there are stories big enough that we can attach ourselves to, something we desperately need in England. So here are 1 or 2 ideas, and in fact the first one starts with Scotland. Because Scotland currently has a land reform consultation there. Can you imagine that in England? Wouldn't that be an extraordinary thing? What a breaking of a social silence that would be. And there's all sorts of fascinating stuff in there, but the thing which particularly caught my attention is this, which I think goes halfway to where we need to be, because it's got this incredible capacity for galvanization, and it's a beginning, I think, of a very big idea. The Scottish Government is talking about setting up what it calls a housing land corporation, which wouldn't be a private corporation, it would be an arm of government, an agency. And it would have the power of compulsory sales orders. And it would basically knock on the doors of the volume house builders and say, we're having your land. And we're not going to pay you the market price for it, we're going to pay you the price that we think we should be paying for it. And what they recognize, and here's another silence which is being broken up there, is that the volume house builders are nothing but a menace. They don't provide houses, they stop us getting houses. They don't provide the houses we want, they give us dog kennels priced like palaces, appalling environmental standards on placeless, grim, depressing estates which no one wants to live on, but we're forced to live there because we have no choice, because there's a housing crisis. And they recognize these people are just parasites. They're basically parasites. They assemble these land banks, they sit on them till they think the price is right, and their money comes from the speculative price of land. The consultation points out that in the 1930s, the land price was 2% of the eventual house price on average. Now it's 70%. That's why housing's so expensive, is the speculative price of land. So they say, right, we're going to cut through this Gordian knot, to hell with these people. We don't need them. They've come over the border and they're sitting like vultures on a corpse. Actually, I rather like vultures, so let's not use that. They're sitting like house builders on a corpse. And we're going to basically just take the land away from them. We'll give them some compensation, but it'll be nothing like the market price because the market price is ridiculous. Then we're going to assemble these sites ourselves, and we're not going to sell houses, we're going to sell plots. People can build their own homes to their own specifications. We know how hard that is in England because the volume house builders have snatched up all the plots. But I think they could go a lot further. And the way I would do it is say, right, we're going to assemble land where houses can be built, and we're going to set some criteria. There has to be X% of social housing, workshop space, public space where children can play and the rest of it. But we're not going to plan this. We're not going to design this. We're going to sell options. You can buy an option to live on this estate. We're also going to bring in people who are on the social housing waiting list. We're going to bring them together with the people who bought options. Here are the criteria. You design the estate. You design the whole neighborhood. We're going to we'll give you the support you might want. You know, here we lend you an architect, we'll lend you a planner, we'll lend you a drainage specialist, we'll lend you the people who do the electricity. You know, you can have expert advice, but we'll wash our hands of this process. We're not in charge of it anymore. You are now in charge of it. And what this does is not only will inevitably produce far more livable, habitable, engaging places than the volume house builders and other developers are currently producing, it creates a community before anyone's even living there. You have to work together from the very beginning. You have a social cohesion from the get-go, which is likely to exceed anything that even a mature estate will begin to produce. And what we're likely to see, you know, apart from anything else, is you know, not just far more habitable houses, but far more habitable spaces around those houses. So instead of these sort of bellway developments with endless tarmac and parking spaces and absolutely nowhere for the children to play, I would expect that most communities would put the children at the center of it. Perhaps allow the children to design the public spaces around their needs, to be outside, to play, to form tribes, to get out of the house. You know, you go to so many housing developments, old and new, around the country, and you don't have to ask yourselves why children are inside the house on their machines. You know, there's nowhere to play. There's just nowhere. Even when there was public space, it's now been taken over by cars. They cannot safely go outside and play. There's nowhere where there's a natural focus for them to gather around. It's a hopeless situation, and yet you bring the children as well into the planning process. And then you get the children building communities which might last throughout their entire lifetimes. You know, you get that engagement where they can take pride in what they have created for themselves and for subsequent generations of children. You give them some help, but you basically put them in charge of the process. An exciting, empowering beginning of an idea. Because actually, you then start to work that idea outwards, and you say, why should developers be in charge of any planning process at all? Why should they be submitting development plans at all? Why should not all neighborhoods be creating the development plans? And then if you want, you can invite developers in to, you know, if there are things you can't build yourself, you can invite the developers in to do it. But you put the community in charge through neighborhood planning processes, again, you know, with access to expertise, but the expertise doesn't run it. The expertise informs it. And then you begin to see how, you know, not just physical development, but society is then rebuilt from the bottom up. And I think there is explosive potential in this. I mean, this is, as I say, just the beginning of it. And the great thing about it is that as a community, you can pick it up and go with it how you want and where you want. To picking up one of the themes in that, perhaps, and this theme being children and where they play and how they engage with each other and how they engage with society, because, my God, if we don't get that right, we're never going to get anything right. We are faced with this extraordinary situation in education where children, despite everything we know about what works in schools, are being treated like geese in a foie gras farm. Basically funneled stuff down their throats and fed with facts and sat down in their desks and basically sedentary, dealing so often with two-dimensional images, two-dimensional teaching. and stuck in one small physical space, which often diminishes and diminishes, especially as the playgrounds get built on and all the rest of it. And I think a political movement, an environmental movement, which put that very much at its heart, will be one that began to inspire and galvanize in ways which we've sometimes up to now found difficult. There is a wealth of evidence suggesting that children do much better, even in their academic subjects, if they spend more time outdoors, if they're taken out to stimulating environments. You're developing spatial skills, you're developing measurement skills, you're developing interpretive, observational skills. There are so many things that children get. But also, you are allowing children who are not well served by the classroom environment to find other ways of expressing their intelligence. I've been working with an outdoor education charity called Wide Horizons, and I do it, apart from anything else, because it's almost a high point of my year, is taking kids out for a few days, rock pooling or into the woods and stuff. Children who have mostly never been to the countryside before and have never seen the sea before. We work with children in southeast London in some of the most deprived schools there. And to begin with, I was very nervous about this. I thought, what have I got to say to these kids? My background's completely different, my experience is completely different, they're just going to think I'm an idiot. But the moment they spill out of the bus onto a rocky shore and they see the sea, your apprehension just vanishes because no one needs to tell them what to do. They're in it. Straight away, they're in there. And one of the astonishing things which I've noticed every single time we've been out now, every time it happens, there's always one kid who shines, who's just brilliant, who's intuitive, who's observant, who sees things before I see them, who always got their hand up first when you say, why is this prawn transparent? Or why is a crab flat? Or whatever it might be. Always, and they're not necessarily right in their answers, but they're always interesting. And this has happened every time. I've said to the teacher, that kid is brilliant. And I said, what? I said, that kid is brilliant. So oh, he's bottom of the class. Every time this has happened. And what you're discovering there is someone who is brilliant, they've got this fantastic intelligence, but it's just simply not being tapped into at all in the classroom situation. And the narrower the curriculum becomes, the narrower the teaching becomes, the fewer and fewer children that serves, and the more who are excluded and left out and basically, will be used as the serfs of our 1% economy on zero-hour contracts and kicked around from benefits to zero-hour contracts for the rest of their lives because no one ever discovered how brilliant they were. Every time I go out, there's some black kid from Peckham who could be the next David Attenborough. Every time I meet one of these children. And that's what you need to discover in these people. They are utterly brilliant, so many of these kids who are just dismissed as hopeless at school because they're in the wrong place. There are some kids who just should not be indoors. I know a couple of boys who are total nightmares indoors. They're just completely impossible. You put them in the woods, no problem at all. They're fantastic. They love it. They're dancing around. They're engaged because they're in the right place. It suits them. It works for them. And I would put that as one of the central planks, getting children outdoors. That every term, every school term, every child should have a week in a wild place in the countryside. That would be, I believe, something which is another one of those ideas which looks quite small, but contains within it the seeds of a revolution. And then expanding that theme a little more, and I'm skating over just a few issues here, the countryside itself. What are we releasing these children into, these children who at the moment aren't nearly feral enough? We need more feral children. What are we releasing them into? Well, at the moment, a highly dysfunctional natural environment. Because, to come back to one of the original themes, because of the farm subsidy regime and all the power and economic structures surrounding it, we live in a place which simply is not working either for the natural world or for human beings. The floods which hammered us last winter, these were not just an act of weather. These were an act of appalling mismanagement of the land. And here we find another vast social silence, because everybody was talking about, oh, look at these idiots building homes on the floodplain, or we need to put in more concrete, more embankments, more drainage channels, and all the rest of it. And you could honestly believe that rivers arose in the floodplain. There was no such thing as upstream. There was no catchment. There was no hills. Because, of course, the great majority of the water which comes into a river comes from upstream. But amazingly, this was just outside the whole scope of the discussion. It's like, oh, look at all this water coming into towns. Do something about it. And you go upstream, and what you find is almost all our uplands are completely bare. It's an astonishing thing. You go to the European continent, and there the lowlands are largely bare, and the uplands are mostly forested, which is what you'd expect, because that's where the infertile land is, the very poor soils, very hard to farm, and the rest of it. Here, the lowlands are largely bare, the uplands are even barer. It's why, while the European average is 37% forest cover, ours is 12%, because the places where you would expect to find the trees are treeless, which also happen to be the places where all the rain falls. I know this because I lived in Wales for 5 years. The hills are where the rain falls. The rain does not fall mostly on the plain. The rain falls mostly in the hills, and it comes rushing down from, if you do not have trees in those hills, it comes pouring straight off them, straight down into the rivers, which have been canalized and dredged to protect farmland. So you rush the water past the farmland, oh, nearest urban pinch point, hits a bridge, and the houses go underwater. Can't we work? Is this hard to see? Yes, it's hard to see because there's a socially constructed silence around it. But to start to say, right, if we're going to have farm subsidies, let's use them for social benefits, not social harm. Let's use them to get the trees back in the hills, to start repairing this ravaged, damaged land, to get some wild, self-willed, fascinating, engaging ecosystems back, to get some places back in which wildlife can thrive rather than constantly being pushed to the edge. And if we get the forests back, why not some of the animals which used to inhabit those forests? Why not the beavers and the boar and the lynx and the wolves and the bison? Why not a rewilded landscape which permits nature once more to find its place, but also us to be able to get out of our ordered, managed, controlled, button-down world, and my gosh, we don't half live in one in Britain, and get out into somewhere where you can leave all that behind for a bit, where you can explore nature in its glorious, serendipitous exuberance, where you can immerse yourself in its wonders and delights. In Europe, I think we could go further. My great ambition is, before I die, to see the first herds of elephants back on the European continent for 30,000 years. I like to limit my ambitions because in order to avoid disappointment. But why not? I mean, we're looking at 30 million hectares being vacated by farmers over the next 30 years simply because of economic forces. I mean, it's just the way things are happening. It's you know, there's a real sadness there as well, but these huge areas of land which people are no longer using. Why not bring back the megafauna that we used to have? Looking for big ideas. Nothing bigger than that. And why do trees, coppice and pollard? Why do birch trees have black and white bark? Why are understory trees like holly and box and yew so much harder to topple and to break than the big canopy trees like birch and oak and lime, even though the understory trees carry so much less weight and are subject to such smaller shear forces from the wind? Elephants. This is an elephant-adapted ecosystem we live in. Why does blackthorn put out 2 or 3 inch spines, vicious, horrible spines which suppurate when they get into your skin when it comes under attack, wildly over-engineered to resist browsing by deer, not browsing by rhinoceros? This is a rhinoceros-adapted ecosystem. We had a megafauna. Everywhere on Earth had a megafauna. Megafaunas are the default state of all ecosystems. at land and at sea. 1776, Oliver Goldsmith described the arrival of the herring off the coast of Britain. He said the main body of the herring were divided into columns, each 4 or 5 miles long and 2 or 3 miles wide. They rolled up the water ahead of them. In other words, they created a bow wave as they came in. And from the shore, you could see them being hit by shoals of longfin and bluefin tuna, by sharks of all species, and by pods of fin whales and sperm whales within sight of the English shore. We could have all that again simply by allowing the seas to recover, by making areas off limits to fishing. At the moment, 0.01% of our territorial waters are off limits to commercial fishing. All the rest is scoured on a weekly basis by beam trawls and scallop dredges and the rest of it. You merely have to say 20 or 30% of this water is going to be off limits, and you'll see this great exuberance of nature returning. And with it, I believe, an exuberance of engagement with the natural world for us, the possibility of not having to travel halfway around the world to the Serengeti to see fantastic wildlife. For me, I don't know, maybe not for you, but for me, this is an inspiring vision. An ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair if we are trying to mobilize and engage people, and to limit our ambitions, to talk only in small and timid and shuffling terms, as unfortunately the Labour Party does at the moment, is to ensure that you are never going to inspire and mobilize and galvanize people, to ensure that they will give up on politics altogether and follow Mr. Farage, because you are saying there are going to be no options within the representative parliamentary system, so we might as well follow a demagogic anti-politics instead. I've just come up with a few fairly random and perhaps eccentric examples of how we can start to generate hope by thinking on a different level, by putting forward this vision of a positive environmentalism. But you can fill in far more than I can do by myself. I mean, we've got to tap into this collective genius, which actually we are so good at. People in general, but particularly, I think, this marvelously creative and diverse environment movement, or movements that we have built over the years, are fantastically good at that stuff, but we're shy about it. We're shy at putting forward these wild and wonderful and woolly ideas, which you need. Yeah, sure, you need the bean counters as well as the profits, as poor Natalie Bennett discovered yesterday. You do need to be able to show how it's going to work. But actually that comes second. First, you need the vision. Otherwise, there's no point in showing how it's going to work. You show how something which is just like we've got today is going to work. Well, who needs that? It already doesn't work. What we need is first of all to put the big ideas out there, and then to work out how we're going to do it, to work out what is desirable before we work out what is possible. Because unless we articulate what's desirable, unless we articulate our grand vision, nothing is going to be possible. We're often called, us Greens, with a small g or a big G, we're often called hopelessly unrealistic. I'd far rather be hopelessly unrealistic than hopelessly realistic. Hopeless realism is what's destroying this planet, is what's destroying human life, is what's destroying community, it's what's destroying everything, because the realism means fitting in with the status quo, going along with the demands of Rupert Murdoch and the corporations and Sir Ian Wood and whoever else it might be. That's realism, and it's utterly hopeless. It's hopeless in two senses of the word. It's hopeless because it's not going to get us anywhere, but most importantly, it's hopeless because it contains no hope. So let them call us unrealistic. I would rather call it visionary, because today's unrealism becomes tomorrow's realism when there's enough hope and determination to actually make it happen. Be true to yourselves. Be true to each other. Be true to the living planet. And you will reach people. It will happen. Thank you.
lot of the problems that you've outlined can be described as tragedy of the commons. So when you get the common access to a good, it gets exploited until the very last person has had their share of that good. But then it seems that your solution to that tragedy of the commons is more access to the commons. Democracy being more access. So just wanted to know
Thank you very much.
how you think that the problem and the solution are related.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. I would actually describe a lot of these problems as a tragedy of enclosure. Enclosure being the capture of the commons, either by private interests or indeed by national interests. You know, that the state took land away from the commons, from communities, just as private interests took land away from the commons. Garrett Hardin's paper in 1968 should actually, I think, have been entitled The Tragedy of Open Access, because that's what he was describing. For instance, he said, you have pastoralists, herders of animals, and they have a common, an area of land, and each of them has got an interest to load that common with as many of their own animals as they possibly can, to maximize their self-interest, because they get 100% of the benefit of that beast, whereas if there's 100 of them, they only lose 1% themselves of the loss to the common pasture. It's not how commons work at all. I've worked with pastoralists all over the world, working on common land. They negotiate between themselves as to how many animals they're going to keep. When I worked with the Turkana in northwestern Kenya, if someone abused the community rules and put more animals onto the common than they were permitted by the very carefully worked out rules which have been developed over many hundreds of years, that person would be tied to a tree and beaten. They did it 3 times, they'd be tied to a tree and beaten to death. Harsh but fair. But what we're looking at there is strictly enforced common rights. And Hardin got it totally wrong in this respect. Had he used the oceans as his example, you know, and every single fishing fleet on Earth just going out and ripping what it can off the shores of West Africa or whatever it might be, then yeah, absolutely, he'd have a point. But that's open access, that's not commons. They're completely different things. A commons is totally different from an open access regime. And he made a grand mistake there. I corresponded with him before his death, actually, and he kind of conceded it. He made a grand mistake there which has empowered all sorts of private interests and indeed national interests to say, right, we're shutting down all these commons because they're going to be managed irrationally by these irrational, stupid people who've somehow managed to survive for several thousand years on them, but we don't know how they've done that because they're obviously irrational and stupid, and we'll take it into the rational ownership of the state or corporations, and oh, all the soil slipped down the hill, and all the trees have disappeared. It must be some irrational commoners coming in or something because we couldn't have done this. You know, what we see is that when those commons regimes are destroyed, everything else gets destroyed. Because actually, the community, that's the level which works best. The local community is the level that works best. And this applies not just to the management of land or the management of fisheries, but to so many other things as well. And this comes back to the point I was making about planning, about designing urban areas or about designing estates and the rest of it, that if you, the community, are doing it between you, you might, Garrett Hardin would say, oh, well, everybody's going to want the biggest house, and so they're going to build bigger and bigger and bigger houses, and soon you're just going to have enormous mansions. But that's not how it works. What you do, you get together to negotiate and design the space between you. And you end up with something that's going to work for everyone, whereas what we got from the enclosure model, where the land is grabbed by the volume house builders working in cahoots with distant authorities, Eric Pickles, for example, what you've got instead is a system which works for no one. That's the tragedy of enclosure. It works for no one, but the wonder of the commons is that it works for everyone.
I never thought I'd get lucky and ask this question. I've got a wagon on a bit of land up in the Black Mountains, and I've been trying to work out how to speak to my farmer about some tree planting, which I passionately want to do. And I plucked up the courage last Sunday when I saw him. And it was, the conversation lasted for 2 sentences. I said, I just falteringly asked him how he'd feel about me planting a few trees on his land. and on the hill. And he said, not possible. Government are paying us not to do this. That was the end of the conversation. Have you got any suggestions for me, please?
Yeah. Well, there has been a slight remission, which is amazing. No one really expected this, but you are now allowed, I think it's 100 trees per hectare on the land without disqualifying yourself from farm subsidies. Have I interpreted this correctly, that he's worried about being disqualified from farm subsidies? Things have shifted as a result of some canny campaigning. So it's better than it was. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was. But you have to plant those trees. This is a stupid thing. You can't just let the land go wild, which is the obvious thing to do, because what you ideally want is for trees to find their own way there, because then you're using local genetic stock, you're allowing the land to find its own way forward. But no, you have to go and buy the nursery stock and plant them. Yeah, there might be a way around it. But it's not as harsh, quite as harsh as he thinks. That's only changed in the last couple of weeks. It's not nearly what I'd like to see, because actually, A, there's no positive incentive to plant trees. Woodland grants, it's very hard for them to compete with the farm subsidy regime. But B, you can't just let the place go wild, which is the ideal solution from my point of view. But there are probably ways through it, so don't give up hope. And just have a look at, well, I can maybe point you to some stuff later. I think I've got some ideas.
Thank you. George, I want to indulge you here. I just wondered, do you not think farmers receive their subsidies to actually feed us?
Thank you. Well, there was a time when subsidies were linked to production. That didn't work out very well either. And so that's why you got all the butter mountains and the wine lakes and the massive loading of stock on the hills and all the rest of it. So now it's been completely detached from production, almost completely, and is just literally being paid to own the land. So there's no clear link there at all. And the reality is that the farmers who don't need the money are the ones who are already highly productive because they're on the fertile land, they're the barley barons and the rest of it, and that money literally goes into buying racehorses, deer stalking months in Scotland. I mean, it is obscene. It is literally obscene what is going on there. And it doesn't make any difference at all to their production. They would be doing the same thing with or without the money. The people who do need the money, the hill farmers primarily, because they're on incredibly infertile land, produce so little that it makes a negligible contribution to food supplies. I mean, if you look at Wales, for example, I'll give you one example, 76% of the area of Wales is under livestock, almost all for meat production. Wales imports, by value, 7 times as much meat as it exports. It's an astonishing, shocking failure of productivity, because this is land which is so poor that it can often only support 1 or 2 sheep per hectare, sometimes 1 sheep per 2 hectares. We have a look at the Amazon and you say, isn't it outrageous? They've cut down the rainforest and there's just 1 cow per hectare there. It's disgraceful. Well, a cow is what, 8 livestock units? So in other words, if a sheep is 1 livestock unit, a cow is 8 livestock units in terms of productivity and impact and the rest of it. That's how it's calculated. So you're looking at land which is far less productive here, and yet we're still paying people to keep it bare. It's pointless, it's mindless. Now, I can totally see an argument for doing everything we can to keep local communities alive, the language, the culture, all the rest of it, but it's patently not doing that either. These communities are dying, the schools are shutting, the shops are shutting, the chapels are shutting, most importantly, the pubs are shutting. These places, there's no income, there's no employment, they're dying on their feet, it's not working. Whereas my feeling is that a rewilding approach, where we see in other parts of Europe, people pay big bucks to go and see exciting wildlife. And it doesn't need any subsidies at all, and it generates a great deal of income and employment. That, I think, has got far more potential for many of the communities, as well as, of course, for the natural world.
Hi. I was interested by the three examples that you brought up about sort of place and neighbourhood-led housing and children-centred environmental education, and also the rewilding of the countryside as being what a green government could do if it really tried, and that trying be sort of now and in the future. And I'm wondering, in that future, what role you see technology and the march of digital technology playing in what a green government could really do.
Thank you. Well, I mean, there's no question at all that we can tap into some very exciting technologies. I mean, you know, in the past 10 years, for instance, we've seen the development of smart meters and a great deal of very interesting electricity use technologies, which have got tremendous transformative potential, but it hasn't been tapped into. And you know, one of the great ironies we see in that case is that all the technology we need is there to create an energy revolution. But it's not being widely deployed, A, because, you know, when it comes to energy, it's a bit like dieting. You know, you can eat a salad, but if you're also eating chocolate fudge cake, buckets of ice cream and chips and all the rest of it, you're not actually going to lose weight. And when it comes to fossil fuels, it's as much a question of what you don't do as what you do. And unless we're getting out of fossil fuels at the same time as we're getting into alternatives, we can talk about the alternatives if you want at some point, but unless you're doing both of those things, then those technologies are always going to be marginalized. And they're always going to be deployed only on the fringes. They're not going to be central to our energy use. So what I'm trying to do here is to illustrate my answer to the broader question, which is to say we need technology, and there's a lot of very exciting potential technological developments, but by itself it doesn't get us anywhere, because it has to take place within a political and economic environment which makes that technology count, which amplifies its impacts. And so don't put your faith in the magic of technology, because it's actually the magic of politics, the magic of community mobilization, which then makes that technology count for something and turns it into a force for good rather than either a neutral force or, in many cases, a force for harm. It comes again from us, not just from the designers of these remarkable, magical things.
Earlier on, you alluded to the Green Party campaign launch yesterday, and I have to admit, I was stood alongside Natalie. I'm standing for MP for Bristol West. One of my experiences of it, though, was that the journalists were asking a very prescriptive set of questions from a particular perspective, which I think you mentioned. What do you think everybody here could do to help move that discourse forward, to help get journalists to have a different set of questions?
Yeah. Yes, and thanks. I mean, I completely agree with you. They were narrowly focused questions, the kind of narrow focus which journalism unfortunately specializes in. Now, of course, those questions also have to be answered. You know, it's not that there's not a reason not to be able to answer those questions. And you know, the frustrating thing from my point of view, because I really want to see the Greens succeeding. I really want to see this green surge continuing to rise. I want to see you elected. I want to see several other Green candidates elected, because then we're really going to see some stuff happening. And my frustration listening to Natalie yesterday was actually the Green Party does have the answers to those questions. It's not that the answers aren't there. Yes, you've got a huge set of policies. You know, you've got the opposite problem to UKIP, you know, who've got no policies at all, and so they're not bound by anything at all. Farage can say what he likes and no one can really hold him to account. You know, it's a very honest and amazing thing that the Green Party's mapped all its policies out in such sometimes excruciating detail. That's a great thing. And the answers are all in there. You've got to be a bit sort of creative about how you answer them. You know, I mean, I would have used the Robin Hood tax, for instance, as being one of my answers to the questions yesterday, for example. But you have to be able to do that too. It's really important that you can answer the price questions as well as the value questions. You know, that's the unfortunate situation that we're in. It's not entirely unfortunate because, as I say, you do need the bean counters as well as the profits. You've got to have both sides of it in there. How do we move the media? Well, this is a very difficult thing, but you know, again, Scotland as well as Greece and Spain and many other places, suggests that it can be done. You know, what happened, you know, in Scotland, which is the case I know best, the media was either completely against it or just ignoring almost everything that was going on there. But it was through the social media, and above all, it was through face-to-face contact, that things were really changed. And it was so fascinating for me as one of the very few English journalists supporting Scottish independence. Even my own paper was completely hostile to it. Seeing how the entire journalistic corps was utterly wrong-footed by what was going on in Scotland, where it was so dismissive of, you know, let these Scots have their fun, you know, it's never going to happen, and, you know, it's just all a bit of Braveheart stupidity, and suddenly, oh my God, these guys mean it. It might happen, you know, and just utterly shocked by the fact that they'd missed everything that was happening. This extraordinary excitement, this great upsurge of political engagement, this tremendous flowering of hope that was taking place there had completely... But, you know, it hardly matters at all. Had the London-based newspapers sided with the Yes campaign, they might have moved the vote by 2 or 3%. It wouldn't have been much more than that. Because actually what counted there, you know, what you had in the No campaign, you had all the newspapers, you had most of the corporations, you had the helicopters, you had the funding. On the side of the Yes campaign, you had the people with leaflets. You had the people going door to door, knocking on every house, every flat in Easterhouse. You know, you had people accosting others in the street. You had the conversations in the pubs. And actually, those were the media that counted. This is the medium that counts more than any other medium. The building the conversation from the bottom up, rather than expecting the gods of the media to create that conversation for you, yeah, we're not going to move it. I can't even move the Guardian. You know, so the chances I could move Rupert Murdoch, that any number of us could, or the Bartley brothers, you know, oh well, maybe if we've got enough advertising spend, we might be able to buy a newspaper or two. But you know, that's not going to happen. But what we can do is create a social environment, a social media, which isn't just Facebook and Twitter. This is the most important social medium of all, which actually makes the mainstream media more or less irrelevant and redundant.
We're in the middle in Bristol of a battle that's culminated in tree protesters in a standoff against our much beleaguered mayor. People trying to save Grade 1 agricultural soil and allotments against a road that many people think are flawed. Lots of planning objections went through the planning process. Hundreds of councillors, MPs, organisations, people who know what they're talking said don't do this road, and yet the road is going ahead. If you widen the lens and these dark areas around, you know, we've got power from Westminster, we've got the West of England Partnership, we've got all sorts of unelected bodies that completely circumvent that democratic process. What do we do? What do we do to regain that power over our land?
Yeah. The problem we always end up with here, and you know, I'm very much on board with what you're saying. The problem we always end up with is we get to the end of the pipe, and you have all these massive forces bearing down on you. It's just like with floods, you know. It's like sort of suddenly you get this wall of water coming on top of you, and we get hit community by community around the country by these enormous processes, and we have to fight them. You know, everything I'm saying about, you know, the positive environmentalism does not in any way preclude trying to stop the bad stuff from happening. Yeah, no, sure, I'm coming to this. But at the same time, we have to be formulating this vision, not just we hate Eric Pickles and all his work, which we do, not just we hate the whole structure of planning as it currently takes place, which we do, not just the Department of Transport sucks and the County Council Highway Authorities and Unitary Council Highway Authorities suck, which they all do, but to say, here's how it could be done, here's how it could work. And there are examples from around the world. I mean, some very interesting ones, Bogota or Curitiba or, you know, many, many places where people are grappling with it and showing how it can be done. or Porto Alegre with its community-based budgets and stuff. And our role, as well as contesting the local horrors which are taking place, which we must continue to contest, is to embed that within the wider picture. The wider picture which prevents people like yourself from burning out, because you can see, we're not just trying to protect these trees, we're not just trying to stop this road, we're trying to build a better world for everyone, everywhere, at least within this nation. We're trying to create a situation where this is less likely to happen. This stuff here is less likely to happen because sometime in the future, it's us who's going to be in charge of deciding whether these things take place or not. Now, that's a long-term project, but it's a long-term project which we can't procrastinate on any longer. We've allowed, and partly because for so many years, progressives in this country have placed their hopes with the Labour Party. And there were times when those hopes were vindicated. You think of the post-war period and the extraordinary, remarkable, inspiring things that Labour Party did. How it transformed this nation. It turned this nation into a country that was there for everybody, into a country where no one was allowed to fall through the cracks, that if you felt ill and you didn't have money, you weren't left to die. It is an amazing, astonishing achievement in a country saddled by enormous debts and deficits, with almost no spending money, which had been ravaged by war. It was able to do all these amazing things. That particular dream is dead. The Labour Party cannot deliver because it was so stuffed with yes men and yes women by Blair and Brown, a whole party of sycophants who are umbilically attached to corporate power. It will take at least a generation for it to clear itself up and become a renewed progressive political force, and by then it's all over. I went into Ladbrokes the other day for the first time in my life to put £100 on that by June 2025 there would be no more than 30 Labour MPs in the House of Commons. They wouldn't take my bet. But, that's the way I see it going, because they cannot deliver. They cannot give us any of the things that we need in this country because there's the wrong people are in there, because this selection process was so narrow and so rigorous, it just weeded out anyone with courage, with backbone, who could stand up for herself, who could say, this is what I believe in, here is my vision, I'm not just going to be a parrot for Tony Blair. And now it's too late, they can't sort themselves out. They might well form a coalition, they might easily be part of government after this election, in which case they will destroy themselves even more quickly than they would if they're in opposition. We've seen what's happened to social democratic parties who implement austerity elsewhere in Europe. They get wiped out. That's what will happen to Labour if it gets into power. The worst thing that could possibly happen to it right now, because it has not got the vision to get us out of the hole that we're in. So we need to build these politics from the bottom up. Now, I have faith in the Green Party. I think the Green Party has got an awful lot to offer. But if it's going to be the vehicle, and we're talking about vehicles here, there's nothing inherently virtuous about being a Green Party. It's what the Green Party could potentially deliver. It can only do that if we not only get behind it, but also get ahead of it. That's the important thing, that we start marking out the territory, saying this is where we want you to come. That we as community groups start mobilizing and saying, right, here is a political map of the world that we want to live in. This is what it's going to look like. And on the particular issue you're talking about, here is how development is going to take place, how building is going to take place or not take place. Here is who's going to be in charge of it, which is going to be us. And there's nothing standing in the way of that. There is no physical impediment. There's no economic impediment to preventing that. It's all political. It's all political impediments, and it's a grip of the 1% or the 0.1%. And it's a grip of the corporations, the oligarchs, the toll booth economy that has developed in this country. But that exists, and this is I felt one of the many great insights in Thomas Piketty's book. He's saying, look, I've explained all these economic trends and how, because of this patrimonial capitalism, we've seen this great growth in inequality, and we've seen how the Kuznets curve extends beyond 1970 and all the extraordinary things that have happened as a result of that. But actually, That's not where it either begins or ends. All of this is contingent on public persuasion. The only reason this has been able to happen is that they have bought themselves think tanks, they have influenced the media, they have captured the public discourse, and they've told us it's all right. They've told us this is fine. The people who are super rich, they're the ones who deserve to be super rich. They're super rich because they're so talented, because they're so amazing, because they're the wealth creators. They are the people who have made this world wonderful. And if you were to inhibit their activities, well, all that money would stop trickling down to the people at the bottom. Exactly. And you know, this is a key insight, and I felt vindicated reading this, because so much of your life, the deeply serious people are the economists. They're the ones who actually make the world go round. And Piketty is saying, no, it's not. It's the persuaders. They're the people who are important, actually, because they create the political and social context within which this stuff is allowed to happen. We are the persuaders. It's not just people like me who've got literally a public platform. It's the face-to-face persuasion, which is what really counts. That's again what we saw in Scotland. That things can be led from the bottom, led from below. And it's us creating that environment of positive public persuasion, positive environmentalism, positive social programs, positive political programs, positive economic programs. But we have to step into that role of persuaders. And this comes back to the Green Party question, which is, what do we do about the media? We become the media. We are the media. This is the most important medium. We use that, and we stop cringing. We stop shying away from the boldness with which we need to speak. We start laying out these visions, and we work with the Green Party, not necessarily in the Green Party, but with the Green Party, because actually, the Green Party is not inherently the place where all the answers are. It's a party which can expand into the zone of the answers, but we've got to create that zone. Physically, when it comes to planning and development, but politically and intellectually and emotionally as well. And deploy these tremendous capacities we've got, this great collective wisdom, the collective genius of people when they come together, which I've seen in so many places in this country and around the world. It's sometimes crushed and stifled, but it's there. We have to tap into this. And in this very rapidly fragmenting political landscape, I believe we have opportunities which simply did not exist before. In my adult life, politically, this is the most exciting time I've ever experienced by a very long way. Things are falling apart. And that's wonderful. That's just where we need to be. Long may they fall apart.
Thank you, George.
And long may we pick up the pieces and build a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, George.